I was in Roxbury at during the Democratic Party convention in, I guess it was 2004, and was one of the founders of Progressive Democrats of America, and PDA. And I know our beloved Tim Carpenter, his spirit is with us today. That was an amazing first day, first conference, first meeting, and you still got it going on here. So thank you very much. 50 years ago, which, as you know, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his impassioned plea to the nation at Riverside Church in New York, which has been referenced earlier. But in his historic speech, Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break the Silence, Dr. King made it very clear that it was past time that the United States end aggressive military actions, curtail irresponsible defense spending, and prioritize addressing poverty and racism in this country. Now, as we face the uncertainty of the Trump presidency, Dr. King's call to action should be instructive as we developed a comprehensive roadmap for resistance and for nuclear disarmament. If we are to succeed in creating a fair, more just, and safe world, we must heed his call. So your conference theme, Reducing the Threat of Nuclear War, is timely, and it really does set forth a blueprint from our drum major for justice. This blueprint will allow us to end the militarization, which now is happening, of U.S. foreign policy, curtail irresponsible defense spending, which it is, and build a real global campaign to eliminate nuclear weapons once and for all. Once and for all. We have this time is ours to do that. In his historic speech at Riverside, Dr. King said, this is another quote from that speech, which is really a phenomenal speech. He said, "A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military spending than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death." So you asked me to talk about how steps towards nuclear disarmament, and Erica where's Erica? I just want to commend Erica because she's been phenomenal. She's done a great job with helping us on Capitol Hill. So thank you, Erica, because she gave my speech. Good to see you. But let me just first take you back 15 years, which set the stage for perpetual war, and why the House is beginning to take steps now towards a debate and legislative agenda for nuclear disarmament, and why your work is so important right now. Now, more than 15 years ago, Congress passed an open-ended blank check for endless war, and as you know, I was the lone member of Congress to vote against that 2001, well, I knew the bill, that authorization was a blank check for endless war. And while it was interpreted to punish the perpetrators of the brutal and deadly attacks of September 11th, it really did set the framework to allow endless war to rage out of control without congressional authority or any president coming back to Congress. Now, a report from the Congressional Research Service 3 years ago, which I asked for, it's a declassified report, it shows that this authorization had been used, now this is 3 years ago, more than 37 times in 14 countries to justify military action, and of course, wiretapping, of course, indeterminate detention, Guantanamo, you name it, it's been used for that. It's been used, of course, since then, many, many more times. And sadly, we know that under President Trump, our perpetual state of war is even worse and really should trouble us all. In just the last 3 months, the AUMF, this is what Trump has done. He has sent more than 1,000 United States troops to Syria to fight ISIS. No connection to 9/11 at all, of course, but they've used that resolution to do that. Sent 300 Marines to Afghanistan to fight the Taliban, and there are reports that more will be on the way. He used a mother of all bombs, of course you know the Moab, our largest non-nuclear bomb on an ISIS cave in Afghanistan, and is propping up a proxy war in Yemen by funding the Saudis. These are only a few of the military actions that's been used recently under the 2001 AUMF. And these are just the declassified events. So we should all be disturbed that many of Trump's war activities are not even public. A nation only exists in a state of perpetual war when diplomacy is really neglected and devalued. We know that it's possible to solve conflicts without bloodshed and bombs, so it's incumbent upon each and every one of us here to show this administration the power of diplomacy, which again, Dr. Moniz and President Obama did. And right now, we are seeing that diplomacy is at the back burner for this administration, which is really in stark contrast from President Obama. Now, while I respectfully and publicly did disagree with President Obama's intervention in Libya and drone attacks, the use of the AUMF for many military and non-military actions, I know for a fact that he did make a shift in our foreign and military policy from the Bush administration. I know that for a fact. He spent 8 years making the world a safer place through diplomatic initiatives. Under his leadership, we saw what was possible when we put down bombs, picked up phones, and faced diplomatic challenges together. When his administration considered using force after the horrific chemical attacks by Assad in Syria, they worked with Russia to get rid of the majority of the chemical weapons when Congress was reluctant to use force. Now, at that time, I was the House of Representatives rep to the United Nations. And I was at the Security Council with Secretary Kerry when that resolution passed. That vote passed the Security Council unanimously. Of course, we now know that President Assad had not gotten rid of all of the hidden chemical weapons, unfortunately. But because of that, President Trump launched an illegal, unauthorized military attack against Syria. And while we were all outraged, and still are, about Assad's use of chemical warfare, this illegal strike, it did not make the United States any safer. It did not help the Syrian refugees, nor did it rid Syria of the remaining chemical weapons. Now, I know you all remember in 2009 when President Obama laid out a very bold and aggressive agenda to seek peace and security by reducing the number of nuclear weapons. 8 years of diplomatic efforts followed the president's pledge. And after nearly a decade of persistence, the Obama administration, together with our allies, were able to negotiate a deal that put a lid on Iran's nuclear program and created the most extensive and intrusive nuclear verification regime ever negotiated. I was pleased to be part of working with the White House, Secretary Moniz, on a very difficult joint comprehensive plan of action, and it was really difficult to get this through. From using, and I remember we had a day, public awareness, a red phone, we called to Iran. I authored the legislation to end our nation's counterproductive no-contact policy. So we've been doing a lot on Capitol Hill prior to the joint plan of action to build the public support for that. This deal has and will continue to make the world a safer place. During the Obama presidency, we were also reminded that the power of diplomacy is not just reserved for the executive branch. Members of Congress are also uniquely positioned to move us closer to a fair and more just and safe society when they embrace the power of diplomacy. But now we must make sure that it does not unravel. We have to be very vigilant on this Iran nuclear deal. We've made history together, all of us, over the past 8 years, but I think we can all agree that this is at risk with this administration. From the constant saber rattling between President Trump and Kim Jong-un, to tense rhetoric being released from the Trump administration, we've been reaching, and we, I think, have reached a watershed moment in history. Now, I'm a member of the Military and Veterans Affairs Subcommittee, and I recently was part of a congressional delegation to visit Japan and South Korea. And let me tell you, a couple of weeks ago, I was in the region. It reinforced my concerns about the potential consequences of rising tensions and militarization. We went to the DMZ, and I saw how volatile the region is and how close we are to a nuclear war. We visited Tokyo and Okinawa, and the memory and impact of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are very real and on everyone's heart and mind. Sadly, our allies in the Korean Peninsula have come to live with the constant threat of conflict, and that should not be the case. Now, after returning from the region, it became clearer than ever to me that we are not alone in our fear of what this president's temperament may cause. Our international allies also believe that the president is capable of tweeting us into a nuclear war. That is why we must continue to put pressure on this president to give Congress a comprehensive strategy for deterring North Korea that puts diplomacy and non-military strategies at the forefront. We must also prevent any president, especially President Trump, from launching nuclear weapons without a declaration from Congress. We have to have this declaration. He can't use the 2001 AUMF. We must also make sure Congress immediately demand that the United States adopt a no nuclear first policy to place a check on the executive branch. No first strike. And so I'm proud to have led my colleagues in a letter to President Obama at the end of his presidency, urging him to adopt his common sense policy, this common sense policy. And so also, I'm proud to co-sponsor HR, I think you know this bill, 669, which would prohibit a first use strike from the president, absent a declaration of war by Congress. We must pass this bill. And Congress must stop being missing in action, if you ask me. We held a press conference Wednesday. 500,000 petitions we received in support of this bill. 500,000. People are waking up to the threat of nuclear annihilation and beginning to lobby Congress. And yes, this is a political struggle. Mobilizing on campuses, registering people to vote, holding members of Congress accountable, such as Erica laid out, electing public officials who support this agenda, and taking out those who don't. And so I would urge you to look at what's in your packet, mobilizing on campuses in response to Trump's nuclear threat, because it really sets forth the political agenda that we all need to adopt and need to work on this day forward. So many of you were part of the effort to bring in the 500,000 petitions, and I really thank you for that. It was really remarkable, it's phenomenal, and we're beating the drum now because of you on Capitol Hill. It's not just legislative efforts, though. We must also pressure this administration to work with our international partners to lead the world in reducing the role and number of nuclear weapons globally. And so I'm pleased to be co-leading the letter to Trump, which Erica mentioned, reaffirming these principles to ensure that the United States leads efforts to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons and materials and to pursue a more cost-effective approach to sustaining and upgrading the U.S. nuclear arsenal. This administration is not just leading us down a pathway to the buildup of a nuclear arms race. In fact, the president intends to aggressively militarize U.S. foreign policy altogether. Look at his budget. You saw this. It's outrageous. Defense increase, more than $52 billion. I'm on the Appropriations Committee. We'll tell you who to talk to vote against this. That's $52 billion above last year's level. His budget puts forth a $1.4 billion increase for the National Nuclear Security Administration, that's the NNSA, to build more bombs. Yet it doesn't make our planet any safer, nor does it advance NNSA's goal of nuclear non-proliferation. His ill-advised budget priorities come at the expense of funding other vital programs, such as housing, Meals on Wheels for low-income seniors, and education. Again, Dr. King in 1967 said in his Riverside speech, he called it like it was and like it is. This is an un-American agenda, and we cannot let it persist. Just know there are many of us fighting tooth and nail to eliminate the use of nuclear weapons once and for all. And believe you me, I'm not alone. The Congressional Progressive Caucus is leading the way in Congress. You've got to look at our budget. I co-chair the Global Peace and Security Task Force, and it really does lay out not only a roadmap for resistance, but it reins in the ongoing waste, fraud, and abuse at the Pentagon. It makes smart investments in our modern defense strategy so our military can respond to current threats and nuclear non-proliferation. And it decommissions our nation's Cold War-era nuclear weapons infrastructure as outlined by the smarter approach to nuclear expenditures. And so, you know, you have many members of Congress on the front lines working for this. Now, I have to just mention this. I worked, many of you know, for a great statesman, Congressman Ron Dellums. I was a member of Sane Freeze. Sane Freeze, some of you remember Sane Freeze, right? Now, we worked on nuclear nonproliferation and disarmament. I marched in the streets wearing my button and carrying a sign that said, "A nuclear bomb is an equal opportunity destroyer." Some of you may remember that. I visited the children of Chernobyl during a visit to Cuba after the 1986 horrific nuclear power plant accident in the former Soviet Union. I've also had the honor of visiting Hiroshima. I went to the memorial and met relatives and descendants of the August 6, 1945 United States and the world's first ever use of an atomic bomb. I saw firsthand the generations of families who carried the carnal consequences of a nuclear attack. That experience and others reaffirmed my belief that we cannot rest until we rid the world of nuclear weapons. These personal experiences have really informed and inspired my life to fight for nuclear disarmament wherever I am and whatever I am doing. But you know what? We all have to live up to Dr. King's challenge to fight these three evils, as Rep. Connolly mentioned, the evils of racism, poverty, and militarism. I tell you, I'm hopeful for a future where we see our wasted war dollars reinvested in our struggle for housing, in our struggling communities for justice. An America where we feed our hungry children rather than building nuclear bombs. An America where no school is without books because the money was spent on another missile program. An America that lives up to the highest ideals of our founding documents, befitting of the true passions of great leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So I hope that you will take from this conference the motivation and the information for this resistance, but this conference is also a time to retool for the fight ahead. It's a time to pause for planning on the path toward ridding the world of nuclear weapons. And as we learn our lessons from the past as a movement for nuclear disarmament, we must include people of color. And the nuclear disarmament movement, which has historically been a white progressive movement, must fight for justice and equality because Black lives do matter. Black lives do matter, so let's not make those historical mistakes in our movement. As I close, I am reminded of Dr. King's charge to us that peace is not just the absence of tension, but it is the presence of justice. And so let's move on and make this a peace and justice movement. Thank you again.